I'm going to talk about today, well, first let me, before I give you my subject, we'll dive right into that in a second, but I just want to tell you about the Magis Center for a second. The Magis Center was founded by Father Robert Spitzer, who some of you may know. Father Spitzer was an educator, worked he went to Catholic University, got his PhD in philosophy there, but then he taught at Georgetown, taught at Seattle University. Eventually, he became the president of Gonzaga University, which he was president there for 11 years. And among other things, he built the Gonzaga basketball dynasty. He was part of that effort to, which they came that close to winning the national championship last year, and he's almost recovered from that game. But what Father, as a philosophy professor, he heard some of the same kind of questions, kind of issues, kind of challenges, year after year from students. He would, and being at a university, he was able to work closely and deeply with a small number of people, small, relatively speaking, to what we're doing now. But he had this kind of desire to leave academia to start this institute called the Magis Institute. Magis is an Ignatian term meaning, more, or it's all for the greater glory of God. It's like not just working harder, but working smarter, doing everything you possibly can, fueled by the Holy Spirit. So that's the Magis Center that he founded. I was working with Focus and the Fellowship of Catholic University students, and we had, Focus has this idea about affinity groups going to people where they are, whether they're athletes, whether they're Greek life, etc. They didn't really have for the kind of science nerds and the real intellectuals on campus, right? So that's Father Spitzer kind of was. We would bring him in as our guy that could talk to engineers and physicists, burgeoning physicists, etc. Right? So he and I started talking, and I eventually left Focus to work with the Magis Center full time, to work with Father, and to join this effort to address these challenges. And so we kind of break them into four large areas. The first one is faith and science. The second one is happiness, and that includes suffering. The third one is virtue, and that includes freedom. And the fourth one is the reality of Jesus. This is kind of the assault on the faith as we see it. And so we're addressing all of those issues at the Magis Center. So if you go to magiscenter.com, the first thing you'll see is a search bar that says type anything here, and you can look up anything that's on the website. But right underneath that, you'll see those four areas that I just listed off. So you can go on there and you can learn about our ideas on these four different topics and why we believe that modern thought, modern science and beyond, contemporary science and beyond, are actually helping the cause. I'm sure you would agree, Dr. Keebler, that it's almost like God planted this stuff there for us to discover now. The general population is taking the opposite approach. They're finding these really fascinating, awesome things like information and in genetic coding and things like that, and they go like, well, let's become more atheistic. Let's have move farther away. And so one of the areas, and the one I'm going to talk about now without further ado, is this area of do we have a soul or not? Or are we just a bunch of atoms and molecules? Is it all matter and energy, or is there something immaterial that is at least extends our definition of nature if it doesn't break it and move us into supernature? Okay, so that's what we're going to talk about today. Up until maybe 500 years ago, this diagram here was appropriate. That everybody believed this to be the case. So you have, this was an Aristotelian concept of the soul. All living things had souls. plants had vegetative souls, animals had that plus sensitive souls, and we, and only we, humans, had rational souls. Not even angels actually had rational souls, because they were intellectual creatures, not necessarily rational creatures, because they didn't do discursive. They didn't learn discursively. So anyway, so we were unique, and that's pretty much the way that that we separated ourselves from the rest of nature, was by our rationality. Now, Charles Taylor wrote this book called A Secular Age. This works. There we go. Charles Taylor wrote this book called A Secular Age. And what he did in that book, is anybody familiar with this book? Have you seen it? Anybody read it? Okay, so this book is I've got a lot of mileage out of this book. I think it's a great book, because what he's done is he's traced 500 years of Western civilization, history in Western civilization, and he has looked at a multitude of factors as to, and it's all to answer this question: why was it almost impossible not to believe in God, say in 1500, and it's so difficult to believe in God now in 2000? Okay, so that was what the book was written about, and he kind of traces this this history of belief that started with theism and then took a deistic turn. So theism, God is intimately involved on a daily, minute by minute, second by second basis with his creation. Deism is kind of like he started it all off, and now he's back. He's out of the picture. He's kind of watching things unfold. Going to humanism, which is God's not even important anymore. It's up to us to make everything happen. To materialism, there's no God. Okay, so he traces this, and he traces it through science, the impact that science had on our thinking. He traces it through things like the Reformation. There's a great guy, he teaches at the Calvin College up in Michigan. His name is James K.A. Smith, and he wrote a book about this book called How Not to Be Secular. And he's an evangelical, and he does a really good job of explaining how the Protestant Reformation flattened our view of reality. So whereas before you had the horizontal dimension and you had this vertical dimension, and they were in sync and complementary, whereas the Protestant Reformation, I mean, so as an example, that things like monks and nuns living in convents and monasteries was an important part of a community. You felt that you were being looked after spiritually, and so everybody had their role. But with the Reformation, that was looked at as, why are these people kind of wasting their time hanging out in these, monasteries, when they could be actually contributing to this God-centered community that we have? So it becomes flat. There's much less of this. So that's one of the issues. But basically, the net result was going from theism, which was the prevailing idea in 1500, to materialism, which is not the prevailing idea in 2000. Because this is what Charles Taylor says. Charles Taylor says, and I think he's right about this, is that there's this thing going on in our heads, in all of ours. Self-defined believers, self-defined atheists. And he calls it the Nova effect. And he says, like, all of these conflicting ideas are floating around, because if you lived in 1500, or let's say you lived in 1300, you didn't know anybody that wasn't Catholic. Everybody in your family, everybody in your community, you might have heard about some Jews that lived in the next town over, and about these Muslims, but you didn't really have contact with them. So we live in this pluralistic society with instant communication, with conflicting ideas flying at us in every direction. And so what Taylor is saying is, there's no prevailing attitude right now. Everything is challenged. So when you feel like, man, everybody's like gunning for us Christians, the other people that you believe are gunning for you feel the same way. that their ideas are constantly being challenged. Our ideas are constantly being challenged, which creates an opportunity for us, because if we have some persuasive arguments and a persuasive lifestyle, excuse me, we can make some headway. So as adamant as Bart is about this idea that we don't have a soul, the soul, or the mind, or consciousness, is actually a really big problem for materialists. And it requires 21st century epicycles. And what I mean by that is, if you remember when we had a geocentric universe, the Earth was at the center of the universe, there was a problem with these perfect circular orbits going around the Earth. The problem was that sometimes the planets went the wrong direction. So you would be observing Venus or Jupiter, and they're going around, and all of a sudden they start going in retrograde motion, right? So they came up with this idea of epicycles, which are circular orbits within the bigger circular orbits, okay? And that fixed that problem. Did it really fix the problem, or did it just make it mathematically feasible? Because you see the Earth there in the center, and there's the sun, one more click there, and here's the sun's orbit, okay? And the rest of that is Mercury and Venus. So that's, and this is, this is an actual solar system, or in that point in time was the geo system with Earth in the center, and all of these epicycles to correct for the fact that the perfectly circular orbits around Earth didn't work. Okay. So to get the beautiful solar system that we know now, you had to move the Earth out of the center and put the sun in the center and use elliptical orbits versus using circular orbits. Okay? Now, this required a paradigm shift. And a paradigm shift in philosophy is actually a defined kind of technical term. It was defined by this 20th century American philosopher named Thomas Kuhn. And so basically, it starts with number one up there, the normal science, and that at that time was geocentrism. Then there's a model drift. Oh gosh, these retrograde motions problem. Then there's a model crisis. There's something like the phases of Venus that now we can see through a telescope, because Venus shouldn't have had phases like our moon's phases if Venus was not, if the Earth was in the center. So you got this crisis that you no longer can fix with the epicycles. And then you have a model revolution, and then a paradigm change, which was the heliocentric universe. And then you have, that becomes the new normal. So Copernicus started this with his On the Revolution of the Heavenly Bodies, and that was in 1543, and Newton finished it almost 150 years later. So there was about 150 years of debate between heliocentrism and geocentrism. Okay, so next. So one way of looking at that is that it was intellectually worked out. Another way of looking at it is the way Max Planck looks at it, is a new scientific truth does not triumph by convincing its opponents and making them see the light, but rather because its opponents eventually die, and a new generation grows up that is familiar with it. And so that was his idea, is that the other guys were just gone, and the young people took over, and they knew what they were doing, and that's you all. So what I'm going to show you now about the soul, when my generation that screwed this all up dies, you'll be there to take it to the right place. Okay, so the immaterial theory of the mind soul is here now. Okay, so there's this new idea that there's a crisis with materialism, and the soul is kind of a wedge topic to bust that whole thing open with. I've got 8 books up here, and I'll spend a minute just talking about these books, because not a single one of these books is written by a Catholic priest or somebody that would be a dyed-in-the-wool kind of faithful believer. These are all written by people that try to take the objective stance in their field. So, for example, I'll start with in the bottom right there, to this side, Thomas Nagel, agnostic, leaning towards atheist. Here's the book he just wrote a few years ago, Mind and Cosmos, Why the Materialist Neo-Darwinian Conception of Nature is Almost Certainly False. Bruce Rosenblum and Fred Kuttner, professors at UC Santa Cruz, they're physics professors, and they just got tired of saying nothing about the consciousness effect in quantum physics, and so they wrote a book about it. And they've taken some heat from their peers, but they felt that somebody needed to do this, and so they put their best foot forward. Irreducible Mind. Edward Kelly, that's his wife, Emily Kelly, up there. They actually are at the Center for Perceptual Studies at the University of Virginia. So it's a state school that studies things like near-death experiences, which we'll talk about in a minute. Emperor's New Mind, Roger Penrose, one of the leading physicists in the world, worked with Stephen Hawking on black holes. He wrote this book essentially saying artificial intelligence is great, but there'll never be such a thing as a conscious computer, a computer that has thoughts, emotions, and feelings. I've looked through the physics of the universe, and there's nothing there that you can actually put together into hardware and add software to it, and that's going to happen. So that was his book, kind of his anti-AI, strong artificial intelligence book, and we'll talk about what that means. David Chalmers, he is a philosopher. We're going to talk about him in a minute, but he came up with this thing called the hard problem. And one of my favorites there, I'll just mention Brain Wars, is Mario Beauregard. He's a neuroscientist. His book, The Scientific Battle Over the Existence of the Mind, the Proof that will change the way we live our lives. And then one of my favorite books up there is The Wonder of Being Human by John Eccles. John Eccles and Daniel Robinson. And John Eccles is a Nobel Prize-winning neuroscientist, and Daniel Robinson is he's a psychologist and a philosopher, they really take this materialistic idea to task in this book. So this is an assault on the physical brain/mind coming from coming from science and philosophy, not necessarily coming from religion. What we're going to do with the rest of the time is we're going to look at some of the key issues involved with this idea of mind and brain. Okay, so to begin with, we're going to rather than list them off, I'm going to go through one at a time. So the first thing you have to understand when you're talking about mind versus brain is there's basically two camps. There's dualism and there's monism. Okay, so dualism is the father of dualism is right or wrong is Descartes, and so dualism basically says that there's two separate substances that are equal, and monism says that one substance is primary and the other one is derivative. So physicalism would say matter is primary, mind is derivative. This is a materialistic physicalist view. Idealism would say that matter is derived from mind. And neutral monism would say there's a third substance that we don't know about yet, and mind and matter come from that. This is an open debate. This is still heavily written about and talked about. And as a Christian, or a believer, a theist, about the only one that would be ruled out of court would be the physicalism. And maybe somebody could come up with a way to work that into Christianity. I just don't know about that yet. But the other ones are all real possibilities. So when we talk about consciousness, it's kind of like talking about, C.S. Lewis has the four loves. We have one word for the four loves. Well, there's one word for different levels of consciousness. So information processing would be pre-conscious. That'd be like the computers. Then you have consciousness itself, which would be an awareness of your environment, but not an awareness of you being aware of your environment. That's one level above. And then one level above that is personhood, what you call it, and then that leads to interpersonal relationships. We're not going to talk about that top one today. We'll talk about the other three. Okay, so on artificial intelligence. Okay, so essentially this is the idea that, well, there's two ideas I'm presenting here. One is called weak artificial intelligence, and one is called strong artificial intelligence. Weak artificial intelligence is that computers can simulate the way that humans think so well that it doesn't matter if they actually are really thinking, feeling, sensing. That you wouldn't know the difference. You could, there was that movie where the guy fell in love with his, PDA, walking, is it her or she? I always get the name mixed up. Which one? Her, thank you very much. But so the device can fool you to the point where it might as well be human. And then strong AI says that there's a certain point we're going to reach, and a couple of people, namely Ray Kurzweil is one of them, that he's an inventor, a real brilliant computer scientist that now works at Google. And they think that with a certain level of computing power, that would be comparable to what the computing is being done in our brain, in MIPS, instructions per second, that the computers will actually come alive. Okay, and that seems pretty crazy to me, but a lot of people take it seriously. I don't know why they think that it's computing power, but that's the goal, is to reset. So what I'm gonna, there's a video clip here I'm going to show you. And has anybody heard about this game Go? It's a Far Eastern game or Eastern game that actually has more strategy to the game than chess. And I mean, there's some people that, it's like the Grand Chess Masters, Kasparov, people like that in Russia. They got the same version in Korea and China for Go. And supposedly, I've never played the game. It's another level above chess. So they built this system called AlphaGo. And AlphaGo played the top guys and beat them. Okay. Now, AlphaGo, they programmed in all of the instructions on how to play the game and the strategies to the game into AlphaGo. After AlphaGo, the same people, and you're going to hear from one of them, created a new algorithm called AlphaGo Zero. That the only thing it had was rules of the game and the ability to learn strategies. So this machine, AlphaGo Zero, learned all the human strategies in a very short period of time and developed its own strategies that were superior to the human strategies shortly thereafter, or maybe in parallel. And it started with just a basic set of rules. So you could basically take something. You could implant what they've done with the game of Go into stock market, into war strategy, into a lot of different areas. That so here's the takeaway from this artificial intelligence section. The takeaway is that that computers are never going to become emotional, self-aware beings like we are, but that they can become almost indistinguishable, like Blade Runner. Oh, that's clone, so that's a little different. But they can become almost indistinguishable from us, and there is a certain power that they would, because of, I say they, is almost like anthropomorphic, but a certain power that the machine has because of the way it can calculate to solve problems in a rapid, real-time type situation, that have a lot of people uneasy, including Bill Gates, including Elon Musk, including Stephen Hawking. About the only guy that's not worried is Mark Zuckerberg. So they argue back and forth about if there's a real risk here. But Musk and Gates and company have created a foundation to kind of monitor where this is all headed, because they really are concerned. And anyway, I could say a lot about that, but and it's not a long-term concern; it's a near-term concern that it's certainly within our lifetime, certainly within a young person's lifetime. Okay, so the next category to tackle, and I'm going to have to pick up my pace a little bit here, is is animal intelligence. Okay, so you've got the crowd that's saying that machines are equivalent to humans, and then you have another group that says animals are equivalent to humans. So I'm just going to tell you about a couple of studies that have been done and what they found. So the first one was a study with a chimp back in the 60s called Washoe. Now, it's less documented than the second one I'm going to tell you about. The second one, well, we'll talk about Washoe for a minute. Washoe apparently learned 350 words in American Sign Language. Washoe had empathy, would recognize if people were happy or sad and would offer them things. I mean, so there was a certain level of communication. Again, this one was not as heavily observed as the second one, which I'm going to talk about, which is Nim Chimpsky, which is Nim is there, and Nim was kind of jokingly named after Noam Chomsky, which we'll talk about in a second. But Nim, Herb Terrace at Columbia University, in a much more regulated environment, worked with Nim. Nim was able to learn 150 American Sign Language words. But Nim was never able to create sentences. Like to Nim, dog bites man and man bites dog were the same thing. Nim had no concept of syntax. And what Herb Terrace would say is that Nim had no concept of concepts. It was total signification. So Nim could point to things, ask for things, label things, but Nim could not create concepts that would describe his ideas, because basically they didn't think he had ideas in that sense, conceptual ideas. So there's been other studies that have been done. These are Washoe and Nim are probably the two best known studies. And they seem to have reached the limit of animal intelligence in both cases. Which leads us to human intelligence. So those animals that Nim and Washoe and many others, they seem to have a little bit of this subjectivity, this self-awareness. It's just kind of hazy, fuzzy there. One of the things that chimps, apes in general can do is they can pass the mirror test. They put them to sleep, and they put a mark on the ape's forehead, and then they have the ape look in the mirror. And initially, it usually tries to do something with the mirror, with the figure in the mirror. But eventually, it figures out that we don't know what it figures out. But eventually, it figures out that the mark is actually here. It's not there. So they've done this with a couple of other species, and it's all these things. If you've done experimental psychology work, or you're familiar with experimental psychology work, is like the testing conditions. Everything is always subject to. Did you do this? Did you think about that? So, for example, like dogs. Dogs are primarily driven by smell, then sound, then sight. So to paint something on a dog's face is pretty meaningless to a dog. So they did actually try dogs with smells. No success so far. But this is you're creeping into human competency right now with self-awareness. Now, we are fully self-aware of ourselves. Like you know right now that you are listening to this talk. You can even take that a step further, and you can know that you're listening to this talk. And this kind of recursive thing could go on for a while. So this is a completely knowing that you're different somehow, knowing yourself in a different way than you know the rest of reality is unique to us as far as we know. There may be other places in the universe, but right here on Earth, right now, it's us. Because I think that C.S. Lewis did a really good job with this bear, which actually is a really important character in this book, That Hideous Strength, because this bear kills the bad guy, and this bear is from the Arthurian forest. He's the seventh of the bears and the one that got away. So there's all this kind of legend in the book. But here's what C.S. Lewis said about Mr. Bultitude. Mr. Bultitude's mind was as furry and as inhuman in shape as his body. He did not remember, as a man in his situation would have remembered, the provincial zoo from which he had escaped during a fire, nor his first snarling and terrified arrival at the manor. Not just the slow stages whereby he had learned to love and trust its inhabitants. He did not know that he loved and trusted them now. He did not know that they were people, or that he was a bear. Indeed, he did not know that he existed at all. Everything that is represented by the words I and me and thou was absent from his mind. When Mrs. Maggs gave him a tin of golden syrup, as she did every Sunday morning, he did not recognize either a giver or a recipient. Goodness occurred, and he tasted it, and that was all. That was getting inside of the mind of a creature that has no concept of I, no subjective awareness of itself. So David Chalmers, he was one of the authors that I had mentioned earlier, he's characterized this as the hard problem. And he's not letting other philosophers off the hook. He basically says that anything that looks and acts like a human, but doesn't have self-awareness is a zombie, and it's not a human. And he's not a believer, believe me. That he's a guy that thinks that we kind of live in the Matrix. I saw a panel with him and a number of other, mostly physicists, and they were talking about, do we live in a computer simulated environment? And then at the end, everybody had to give their percentage, and I think he was over 50%. So anyway, the one person that we use for Magis, Lisa Randall, that we used her in one of our documentaries, she said 0. So that was nice. Okay, language and communication. I'm not gonna say a lot about this except that Noam Chomsky, that the chimp was named after, that Nim Chimpsky was named after. The reason they called the chimp Chimsky is because Noam Chomsky has said forever that only humans have language, and that we're the only ones that have syntax, we're the only ones that have grammar. He teaches, he's at MIT. Politically, he's pretty far left. He was a huge Bernie Sanders supporter this last election. But he's smart enough to recognize that this point here. And by the way, Bob Berwick, that wrote the book with him, is a computer scientist at MIT, and he came to the conclusion that this stuff was a lot harder than we thought by trying to write language programs, like natural language programs. So go to the. Let me say one other thing about that is that so one of the things that several people have looked at is that language and they did in this book, is that language seems to have suddenly appeared on the scene, and they're guessing about 70,000 years ago. So you have Homo sapiens, genetically modern people, for about 200,000 years. That's the current estimate. I just saw something where some scientists found 300,000, 350, but 200,000 years you had Homo sapiens in Africa, and for 130,000 of those 200,000 years, they were not doing much. Then all of a sudden, language and things start to go fast. And before you know it, there's Homo sapiens all over the planet. There's art, there's religion, mathematics. So is this tied to language or not? This is complete speculation on my part, by the way. I would not write a paper about this, but it just seems there's some interesting coincidences here. But so, and what makes it even more interesting is that you look at the case of someone like Helen Keller, which is the next slide. Okay, so Helen Keller, as you know, was deaf and blind, and she had no language, okay? And one day, after a lot of hard work, Anne Sullivan got some words to her. And so here's what she wrote. This is in that book, The Story of My Life. We walked down the path to the well house. Someone was drawing water, and my teacher placed my hand under the spout. As the cool stream gushed over one hand, she spilled into the other the words water, first slowly, then rapidly. I stood still, my whole attention fixed upon the motions of her fingers. Suddenly, I felt a misty consciousness as of something forgotten. Somehow, the mystery of language was revealed to me. I knew then that W-A-T-E-R meant the wonderful, cool something that was flowing over my hand. That living word awakened my soul, gave it light, hope, joy, set it free. Next. I left the well house eager to learn. Everything had a name, and each name gave birth to a new thought. As we returned to the house, every object which I touched seemed to quiver with life. That was because I saw everything with the strange new sign that had come to me. On entering the door, I remembered the doll I had broken. I felt my way to the hearth and picked up the pieces. I tried vainly to put them together. Then my eyes filled with tears, for I realized what I had done. And for the first time, I felt repentance and sorrow. I learned a great many new words that day. I do know that mother, father, sister, teacher were among them. Words that were to make the world blossom for me. It would have been difficult to find a happier child than I was. I was laying in my crib at that close of that eventful day, and I lived over the joys that had brought me, and for the first time longed for a new day to come. So the point here is that language not only was an intellectual awakening for her, but a moral awakening. First time I ever felt repentance. I mean, she was a terror, grabbed food off the table, other people's plates, threw things, broke things. Never once did she feel a sense of guilt. But somehow she connected learning words with this kind of intellectual and moral awakening. And what was the first thing, what was the first job that Adam had in the garden? Another coincidence there. Does anybody know? Name the animals. Yeah, so that so there's another language type thing there. So language and rationality are intimately connected, is the point there. Transcendental desires, okay? So all of us have this kind of inherent, inborn desire for truth, love, justice, goodness, beauty, and home or being, okay? And so we measure everything by this perfect version of that. So, we're loved but not loved enough. The sunset's beautiful, the person's beautiful, but not quite beautiful enough. I learned a lot, but I need to know more on the truth side. So where does this come from? So Bernard Lonergan, a Jesuit philosopher, he came up, well, not just, this is the argument from desire, but this is his version of it. And the argument works like this. We recognize every imperfection in truth, love, goodness, beauty, and home. How could we recognize every imperfection unless we had at least a tacit awareness of what perfect truth, love, goodness, justice, and home were, or is like? Where did we get our tacit awareness? The cause must be commensurate with the effect. Therefore, we must have a connection with ultimate perfection. So basically, up until this slide, what we've been talking about is to be human in the fullest sense that we know it about being human. But with this slide, it takes it beyond. We're entering into a transcendent dimension. We're aware of it. We desire it. We don't fully recognize it, but we know enough about it to make us, want more. Okay, so we're not satisfied. We never will be. Saint Augustine, said at the beginning of the Confessions, "Our hearts are restless until they rest in Thee." So that's kind of a present moment reaching out to eternity through these transcendentals. But what about eternity as time that continues, or some other form of continuation past this life? So for that, I'm going to talk about near-death experiences. And near-death experiences, here's the thing about near-death experiences, NDEs, is that there have been NDEs recorded since ancient times. Plato wrote about an NDE. But they were infrequent. They were things that somebody heard about, happened once in a while. Well, 45 years ago or so, modern resuscitation techniques were invented. And now people every person that had a massive heart attack 50 years ago died. No one came back. But now it happens every day. So some of the people that are really interested in NDEs are cardiologists. A couple of the guys that you'll see up here are cardiologists because they keep hearing about this from their patients. They keep hearing about this this journey and return. Anyway, before you hit that, I'm going to say one last thing. Is that Gallup estimates that in the United States alone, 8 million people have had some sort of an NDE, and I'll explain what that means in a minute. And so what happens in a near-death experience? Okay, so this is an interesting thing too, because the same things happen in near-death experiences by and large. Okay, so to begin with, the person has a sense of being dead. They all of a sudden they realize, I'm dead. Then they go, but this is pretty cool. After that, they can have an out-of-body experience where they see them. Maybe if they're in the hospital bed, they die in the bed. And by death we mean clinical death, flat EEG, no gag reflex, no pupil dilation. So this whole idea of clinical death is being re-examined because of some of these studies I'm going to show you in the next slide. People are saying like, well, maybe we're too quick to call people dead, because there was a list of things. That list has changed over time too. You've heard of this horror stories about people that they declare them dead, put them, they would go to bury them or something, they wake up, right? That's happened. So they're very careful about. And they call it's clinical death. It's not, and it's a technical term, and you have to meet those criteria that I just mentioned. So, but one of the things that's interesting about that criteria is that flat EEG means no electrical activity in the brain, maybe some sputtering, in the lower brain, electrical sputtering in the lower brain, but essentially the brain is shut off. And these people are having not just experiences, but vivid experiences, more dynamic than anything they've ever experienced previous. So anyway, now a lot of this, when I said there's 8 million people, the majority of that 8 million stop at that third item, the out-of-body experience, and they go right to the bottom, suddenly finding oneself back in your earthly body. But some percentage go further into a sense of moving up or through a passageway or tunnel. Depicted by the lady on the right, an encounter with a powerful light or a being of light, an intense feeling of unconditional love and acceptance, encountering human or angelic beings, experiencing a life review. That's the one I don't necessarily want to go through, because you see yourself in the perfection of God, and you see your life, and you see everything, not everything, only everything that you've done, but everything that you've made people feel about when you did these things. So, if you did things that were really positive and gave people positive, experience, you would that would be great. But if you're got a mixed background like me, I don't know if I want to do this part. And then receiving knowledge. That knowledge could be secrets of the universe, or it could be things like the little sister that Colton learned about. He met her, but sometimes the people say they just hear about things. And then then there's a decision point. And typically people say that I knew that I wanted to go back, and I woke up my body. And so that's basically what happens. Now, so where are we at with near-death experiences is that there's some fairly substantive studies. Probably the biggest one in terms of numbers and internationally is that first one by Sam Parnia. That has over 2,000 cases that they're studying, and they're constantly adding to that database. One of my favorite guys, if you just want to go look at a video of somebody talking about near-death experiences, is Pim van Lommel, because he is so matter-of-fact. He's a cardiologist. Is that he's so believable the way he talks about it. You know, that he's not wide-eyed, or, you know, he's not, oh, man, it's amazing. No, it's like, this is what happened, and then the person, you know, he has a little bit of an accent, he's a European. That Kenneth Ring, very interesting study, NDEs in the blind. Some of these people have been, there's a couple of YouTube videos you can see, people blind from birth that could see in their NDE. And they're trying to describe what they saw, but they've never seen anything before. You know, so they don't know the names of colors, they don't know the names of shapes. It's just really bizarre. And then Jan Holden, she's kind of she's actually not a doctor. She's got a PhD in counseling, and I've talked to her. You know, she's done some work, helped the Magis Center, because she's the collector of everything. You know, she's the one that she's kind of the record keeper for all these NDEs, and she lives in Dallas, teaches at the University of Dallas, and she's pretty neat. There's a website there where you can check out all this stuff. But again, NDEs, is it conclusive evidence? No. Can you say that, like, because I know I got into there's a Christian Catholic doctor that I know that's really involved in the pro-life movement, and when I started talking to her about this, she just looked at me like, you got to be kidding me, you know. And so you're going to find people all over the spectrum for this ND stuff. But I wanted to bring it up because it has become more mainstream. It has become a lot more frequent because of resuscitation techniques. Everybody knows somebody that says they had an NDA practically, if you've been around for a while. I was getting my hair cut, talking to the lady that was cutting my hair, and another woman in the salon said, oh my gosh, I overheard your conversation. My stepfather had cancer, and he was so afraid to die. He was panicky. She goes, and he died. She goes, but he came back. And she goes, and after that, he lived for another 1.5 years. And he had so much peace about it. He had zero fear of dying. You know, this is just a lady in the shop just telling me. I hear these stories. I mean, you know, because I talk about this stuff a lot, I hear a lot of stories. So anyway, you know, take it with a grain of salt. Anecdotal stories could be, might be. Look at some of the studies. I think they carry some more weight. What I close on this point, I think new evidence is affirming the Western wisdom tradition. We do have a soul. We are more than our material bodies. There's this kind of converging body of evidence. There's no one thing that you say, that did it. But it's like, you know, it's kind of the inferential type of evidence that you would use in a court of law to prove a case. You've got enough factors, you know, the streams of evidence built into a river of conclusion, you know, kind of thing. You know, you can join Socrates and Augustine and Aquinas, and I kind of like this picture with that's Pope Benedict holding up a picture of Pope John Paul II. It's kind of cool. Or you can join Bart and you can stick with materialism and work those epicycles. Thank you very much. Yeah.